Hey everybody, I'm Nick Kolakowski, host of Tech Connects, where we dig into all aspects of the tech industry and tech recruiting that matter to you. For our latest episode, I'm thrilled to welcome Kara Sprague, CEO of HackerOne, a cybersecurity company that combines AI tools with services such as bug bounties. With over 2 decades of experience as a technical leader, Kara has risen through the ranks, holding significant roles at F5, McKinsey, Oracle, and HP, culminating in her recent leadership at HackerOne. Kara brings a unique perspective on the intersection of technology, leadership, and diversity. Notably, she serves on the Girls Who Code board and champions the idea that diversity and meritocracy are not mutually exclusive, but rather complementary forces for organizational success. Given the ongoing discussions nationwide about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I wanted to get her perspective on diversity in tech. So let's listen in. Well, Kara, thank you for being on. Obviously, with your extensive experience, you've witnessed some pretty significant changes in the tech industry. And I'm really curious. There's a lot of debate and discussion right now over women in tech and equality in tech. How do you think the landscape's evolved, like since you've entered the tech industry, and especially in terms of women in tech? Like, what's changed and what hasn't, for better or worse?
Well, I think there is a lot more awareness and a lot more conversation about diversity in tech. And over the last few years, you saw a number of organizations and leaders really come out and verbally support causes that would drive more diversity and inclusivity in their tech environments. You're exactly right. We now are seeing a different climate out there. And in some cases, it's less appropriate, or leaders are feeling less comfortable expressing those views. And in other cases, some leaders, I think, are regressing back to maybe the views that they held all along. But when I look over the multiple decades that I've seen the industry, the actual stats, I would say, unfortunately, have not changed that much. When you look at the percent of women that are graduating out of computer science and other STEM related degrees, not a huge amount of change over the decades. When you look at the women that make up our technology and our STEM workforces, the percentage change has not been substantial. And then when you look at the top of the companies for example, the C-suite and in the executive ranks, those percentages, while they've creeped up a bit, we are still very, very far away from anything close to parity.
Yeah, it's interesting because for years I had a spreadsheet running where every time a company issued a diversity report, a major tech company, I would go through and on my own kind of list the various percentages of, women, people from underrepresented groups, et cetera, and then monitor that progression over the years. And it was always astounding to me how there was so little, even at like the largest organizations that had supposedly devoted themselves to greater diversity, like the percentages only very incrementally increased, like, or even went backwards in some cases, which was kind of terrifying in its own way. And in every case, whenever I asked, these respective companies' PR about it, they would always blame it on something else. They would always blame it on, it's the educational pipeline that's not routing enough women through STEM, or some other issue, or we're not introducing something early on in elementary school that's preventing people from finding, CS as a career. Do you think that's a case sort of like kind of passing the buck on a lot of those companies' parts? Or do you think, any change by definition is going to be incremental? It's always been confusing for me, and it's a little disconcerting too. So I'm just wondering what your take on that is.
So, look, your observation is spot on. The pace of change does seem to be glacial. I mean, even when it's reported in terms of how many years will it take before we achieve parity. There's a lot of things that look at calculations like that, and it's still in the oftentimes 100+ years, which seems crazy. But then when you take into account some of these companies and, some of the larger companies that you were probably tracking have thousands of people in their workforce, at that point, changing the mix of the workforce is very difficult, especially, if you imagine you're recruiting something like 10% incremental workers every year. And then you look at the workforce and you have to take into account, how much can you really move the mix at any given time. So I think it is actually something that is very difficult to change. It's not dissimilar from technology organizations themselves, which are looking to modernize. They're sitting on a boatload of legacy technology, and every year there's only so much you can do to modernize it a bit. And so what it looks like over time is just this very slow progression towards something a little bit different. So I don't think it's surprising, but it is disappointing.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree on that. In sort of in that vein, you do see a lot of companies allude kind of very generally to wanting to promote diversity because it leads into productivity and creativity gains for the company, no matter what they do, whether they're hardware, software, whatever. And I'm just curious from your perspective, just elaborating and digging down a little bit into like kind of on a more, I guess, tactical level, how that diversity equates with enhanced productivity, with boosted creativity, with all that good stuff. And then I guess related to that, I mean, what do you think the best ways are for companies to like measure that impact of diversity? Because that's the other thing too. People are like, oh, how do we actually like gauge this impact? I imagine you have thoughts on that too. So I'm just curious about what you think.
So one is I consider the research that's out there, and there have been studies done over many years looking at many different domains and across many different geographies, which show time and time again that diverse teams tend to outperform teams that are not diverse. And when you dig into the reasons why that is, it does come from the fact that when you bring a diversity of perspective, that creates more resilience in the team. They are not overly reliant on one particular viewpoint or perspective, but they are taking into account many different angles when solving problems. It also means when you have more diversity in a team that you can combat cognitive biases a lot more, because the different perspectives will bring different sets of biases, but you don't have one single one that ends up being dominant across the group. It also means that you'll have different problem solving approaches. So it's not just bringing a different set of experiences, but different approaches to how you take on a problem. And so all of those different perspectives bring more robustness in problem solving approaches, which yields better outcomes, better performance. And we see this in many, many different studies, looking at, for example, the financial performance of diverse teams, or looking at over time the stock market performance of companies at varying levels of diversity. So I think the data and the research is pretty clear in indicating that, and then also the drivers are now a lot more clear indicating that. But when you get to actually, well, how do I measure it? If I add, I'll make this up. If I add one more woman to this team, what is going to be the impact on the team's output? That itself is not very well measurable. And what you have to just think of and consider over time is just as you're looking at building organizations and building teams and trying to go after problems, making sure that you are getting a diversity of perspectives, which often comes from bringing in a diversity of backgrounds and a diversity of races, ethnicities, and genders, that can contribute to the overall performance.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. I imagine the other thing too, I mean, obviously this depends on the type of company, but companies that serve kind of a very strong B2C audience, like the Apples of the world, where, you have a diverse team, and that sort of allows you, I imagine, to kind of get a broader scope of what your customers would actually potentially want out of something. It allows you to kind of see around corners in terms of something, that a certain demographic might want out of a product that you wouldn't get otherwise when thinking about that. So imagine like customer satisfaction too, in that context might also play into it somehow. Like you could survey your customer base and then figure out that like your more diverse team is leading to products that people actually want.
Well, certainly I think that's also important, which is, every company these days is now reliant on technology in some way. And so technology is literally changing the lives of every single human on this planet. The humans on this planet are themselves very diverse. And so it makes sense then that you would want the people that are driving the direction of the technology and the direction of the solutions that are being developed to reflect the population that they are serving. And certainly, I think there's something to be said about that. I guess there's another angle I would bring to this, and it ties back to, for example, some of the work that I'm doing at HackerOne, which is one of the fundamental premises that HackerOne brings is that the diversity of perspectives you get by involving a global community of security researchers means that you have fundamentally better outcomes in your cybersecurity stance. because you're tapping into the creativity of this very, very diverse set of researchers that take different approaches to the problems. I mean, in some cases, what we're seeing is we're seeing amazing insights come from people that are teenagers, have had very little formal education and experience around cybersecurity, and yet they are the ones that fundamentally can figure out how to break something that many other people are unable to see, or many of our decades of investments in tools and solutions can't fix. And so that's just like another example of where diversity can be a very powerful tool.
Yeah, I imagine with cybersecurity as well. I mean, one thing that our cybersecurity writers keep highlighting again and again, what they write for us when we have discussions with them, is that the gap between sort of the amount of cybersecurity people who are actually out there working right now versus like the number of open positions and the needed positions by 2030 is huge. So I imagine that if you appeal to more groups to enter the cybersecurity workforce and make it an appealing job, you hopefully begin to fill that gap, although that gap seems so massive sometimes it's terrifying. And then obviously that leads to more secure companies, a more secure federal government, because I mean a lot of the open positions are within within that federal sphere. I guess, I mean, in the context of HackerOne, how do you, what's, because I mean, I'm fascinated by cybersecurity, so I'm tangenting onto this. What's the appeal, or what's the best way to kind of issue kind of a broad-based appeal to as many groups as possible to get involved in cybersecurity, especially since a lot of cybersecurity to an outsider seems really arcane at moments and not necessarily intuitive to grasp? I mean, what's the pitch almost that you shoot out there to everybody?
Well, what we talk about is we are doing work that fundamentally makes the internet safe. And that is absolutely critical. And our objective ultimately is to ensure that no individual or community suffers loss from a cyber attack, which is, I think, a mission that pretty much anybody ethical can get on board with. And when we're looking at talent pools, the really cool thing about HackerOne is that we're tapping into multiple talent pools. There's one talent pool which we bring in as full-time employees into the company, which is around building our platform and building the operations of the company. But as if not more important is the pool of talent of global security researchers that we are looking to tap into and connect those with the businesses that we serve as customers. And so, that pool is, at this point, millions of people large. And as I said, it can be basically anybody with a computer and with an internet access can teach themselves some of the tools for how to learn how to hack anything. There's a bunch of free resources that are available online for people to learn some of the tools and techniques for this. And in many ways, we're creating economic empowerment for that group. I'm particularly proud of the fact that over the last 12 years of HackerOne's history, we have awarded over $380 million in bounties to these researchers. And 50 of these researchers have actually been awarded 50 million, 50 researchers have been awarded $1 million total in bounties over the course of their work on the HackerOne platform. And I just think that's absolutely so cool. Yeah. These are people that have invested their time. They are participating in ethical hacking. They are making corporations, the businesses, and the government services that we access fundamentally more secure. And they are building economic freedom and empowerment from it.
It's so cool. How is, I mean, the newer generation of AI automated tools, I mean, in terms of everything, how is that changing everything? I'm very curious about that as well, because that's sort of, a major deal right now within the cybersecurity sphere.
Yeah, well, AI is a double-edged sword. It's a technology or a tool, and it can be used for good as well as for bad. What we are seeing is we're seeing a lot of cyber attackers are adopting AI tools to basically broaden their impact, enable them to offer more sophisticated attacks. For example, you see this in the very, very realistic but fraudulent calls of people impersonating bosses to try and get finance people to provide money to accounts that they shouldn't be sending money to. There was one example of a person last year that it lost $30 million through such a scam. And then, AI is also necessary to really help enable the cybersecurity workforce, the defenders, to scale their impact. The talent gap that you talk about is real. It's estimated today to be on the order of 4 to 4.8 million workers worldwide. which is an incredible amount of talent gap. And we need to turn to tools like AI, like automation, to really take a lot of the grunt work and the drudgery out of cybersecurity, get out of this cycle of false positive alerting, and into a much more impactful cycle of finding and addressing the issues faster.
Yeah, no, the spear phishing is getting crazy. Like you see
Yeah.
these examples online of like AI generated whatever. It's like, whoa, it's like it gets to the point where, I mean, there's sort of that stereotype of a lot of these attacks as being, or at least the user facing aspect of the attacks in terms of the actual messaging is not being that sophisticated, and you can see through it easily because of all the misspellings and whatnot. And now it's getting like terrifying in terms of
Yeah.
like the reality of it. Shifting back to the diversity side of things, well, the other thing, I mean, and this sort of loops into what we were talking about before we got diverted onto to AI and cybersecurity job gaps and things like that. Um, from a managerial perspective, in terms of not only ensuring that teams are more diverse, but as we were talking about before, ensuring that there's an impact, in terms of productivity and in terms of creativity and things like that. What can managers and people, it's startups who are running basically everybody at the company, what can they do to ensure that their diversity initiatives yield sort of those tangible results that, everything from the hiring all the way through to whatever the final product is kind of reflects like a trying to think of the best way to phrase this, like kind of the positivity of the diversity initiative.
So I would encourage people to focus a lot of efforts on a couple of areas. One is taking bias out of as many of the people processes as possible. There's bias when you're doing recruiting because the way that many of our job profiles are written do have inherently biased language. There is gendered language. There's many studies coming out of, I believe, Stanford that point to this. And so there's ways that you can take some of that bias out of writing of the job description to the actual candidate pool that you have. For example, requirements that your candidate pool reflect some amount of diversity. Also requirements that your interview pool equally reflects some elements of diversity so that you have it on both sides. Then all the way into your talent evaluation processes. Again, ensuring that bias is taken out of that process. All the way through to evaluations and matching people with sponsorships and mentorship opportunities. There's bias at every point in most environments, and you have to be very intentional when you're designing your people processes to make sure that you're eliminating as much of it as possible. And where you can't eliminate it, make people aware that the bias is there, so that they can at least mentally try and do something to combat it. So that's one part of it. And then the other part of it is inclusivity, right? Like much like pouring water into a boat with a bunch of holes in it isn't very effective. If you're driving a lot of diversity into your company, but you're doing nothing to create an environment that's inclusive and actually make it a place where people feel they belong, feel like they can thrive, that is going to be counterproductive. And so a focus on inclusivity is also very important. And that's really where I see the roles of employee resource groups, communities, creating intentional sponsorship and mentorship programs to connect people with people that can they can aspire after themselves in a company. Like those are all very important programs as well to ensure that you have an inclusive spirit across the company.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I was talking to a hiring manager the other day, and what she was saying, and this is a point that other people have made, is that increasingly the hiring apparatuses of various companies are relying increasingly heavily on automated tools, on AI tools to do everything, write job postings, to obviously sort through candidates and things like that, and that because the people who are building these systems are coming to the table with their own biases as they build them. Unfortunately, a lot of the tools can potentially reflect the biases, and whether that's extreme, like we've seen in some examples of some products that have been taken offline really hastily, or subtle, where it's difficult to notice. It's still there. But it seems to me that there's an issue, maybe issue is too strong a term, but HR certainly needs to solve for, sure, you can use these AI tools to generate job postings to kind of automate as much of your HR hiring process as possible, but you still need a fair degree of like human oversight that's trained in anti-bias measures in order to ensure that everything kind of goes the way it can, that you can't rely too heavily on an AI tool just to somehow magically speed up your workflow and get things done. Do you think that's a message that, I mean, every HR person I meet tends to be pretty hairy. Do you think that's a message that HR is going to be receptive to, that there needs to be kind of more humanity in order to like fully get diversity woven into the staffing of each company? Or do you think people are just going to be like, oh, I'm too harried. I've got too many hires I need to make. Like, I'm going to go with an AI tool, whatever. We'll just deal with it later. I mean, I don't know. What do you think?
I absolutely believe it's important for us to take as much bias out of the AI tools that we are using, and also recognize, especially in today's climate, there's not a very heavy emphasis top down on AI safety and trust. And what you're pointing out is precisely right, which is a lot of the AI tools that are out there are not solving for reducing bias. One especially that comes to mind was a recent foundation model that was released and tested. And what the test revealed was, when you ask the model generate an image of a person in a specific job, it offered very biased perspective of what a person in that job should look like. And it was an illustration of the bias that was inherently built into this AI model. And that's something that we should all be conscious of in AI models, whether we're using them in our recruiting efforts and our talent development efforts or any aspect of our businesses, is these models do come with bias. And whether or not you are the model provider or you are a person who is just using a third party model, you want to really be aware of how much of that bias is going to get exposed in the application or system that uses it. So I do think that it's important that we put more emphasis on that. And when we bring it back into the lens of people operations teams and recruiting and talent development, yes, there is going to continue to be a need for humans that do truly understand where bias gets introduced in these processes. And they will have to carefully scrutinize and show a lot of discernment about what tools they use and what outputs from those tools they use in order to take the bias out of their processes.
I just feel every HR manager I know like seizing up a little bit, just because there's a lot of these tools are presented as a way to make things easier, but as with everything else, what seems easy initially is obviously not so much once you actually begin to weave it into the workflow. So I mean, in terms of the women in tech, which is a huge, as we were saying at the beginning, like it's a huge topic right now. There's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of people who are responding to, I guess, what you would term external events, and potentially changing their policy or how they're approaching this whole issue. What advice do you have for women who are aspiring to leadership roles in tech, and what can companies do to actually support them? Because unfortunately, it's been the case that support for women in tech is oftentimes not there. And it's, and that desperately needs to change. But companies also need to take concrete steps. Like, what can they actually do as well?
Yeah, for women, so women that are aspiring to leadership positions in tech, my advice to you is have grit. Don't give up. We need you. And there are places that foster, inclusive environments, and that do truly value diversity. They are out there. Just find them. So find ways that you can contribute in tech in an environment that makes you feel belonging, because those do exist, and we welcome you. For companies that are aspiring to create a more welcoming environment, I would go back to what I think are the key levers here, which are lever number one: take bias out of your processes and be clear and intentional that is your aim, and do it systematically. And then number two is ensure that you have put in place the right things to create a sense of belonging and inclusivity for the diversity that you do bring into the company.
Cool. All right. Yeah. No, it's a rough. I feel like it's a rough period a little bit right now, just because you have so many well-intentioned people who are trying to weave more diversity into tech, but at the same time, the same pressures that have confronted the tech industry on these fronts for so long, I mean, obviously continue to be there, and so it feels a little bit dispiriting almost for people who really want to diversify their workforces. But I mean, it also seems like there's causes for hope, because people just aren't giving up, which is also nice. I mean,
well, yeah, and I'll say, look, I also think that there is a way that we can take what is happening in the current environment and pivot this and use it to our advantage, which is make sure that we go beyond just words and truly implement these measures in action and systematize them within the companies. Right? At the end of the day, it's not about how much diversity shows up on your external charters or on your values or other places. It's truly about how much do you embrace diversity and incorporate and remove biases out of your processes and create an inclusive environment. That's what truly matters, and that's what's going to move the needle.
Yeah, like it's not just, I mean, every single step of the culture, like workforce processes and culturally and blah, blah. Yeah, everything. I mean, yeah, you can't, I mean, too often it gets treated like a buzzword, but you ultimately need like everything within a company, every aspect of it to reflect it, which is, I mean, it's a lot of effort, but obviously in terms of, as we were talking about before, like the productivity and the creativity, et cetera, like the results are worth it. And I think if companies hopefully realize that more and more, then they'll be more committed to devoting those resources to making sure that that actually happens, which would be great. So
right, and just to your point, as like AI and tools are out there to make a bunch of people's lives easier, you can find AI and tools that show less bias. And so if you make that an intentional part of your selection process for these tools, that will pay dividends over the long run, because then you're not having your AI system actually perpetuate systems of bias from the past, but you actually have an AI system that's actually helping proactively turn your system and remove more of the bias.
Well, that was a fascinating discussion. Here are some quick takeaways from Kara that you can hopefully use in your own journey through the tech industry. First, progress in achieving parity in tech remains incremental, unfortunately. While awareness around diversity in technology has increased, actual progress has been slow. Graduating rates of women in STEM fields and their representation in technical workforces, particularly in executive roles, have shown really limited improvement over the past few years. That means organizations will recognize that achieving meaningful change requires sustained, long-term commitment and systematic efforts to address underlying barriers. Second, diversity really is a catalyst for enhanced performance. Research consistently demonstrates that diverse teams exhibit superior performance due to varied perspectives, reduced cognitive biases, and diverse problem-solving approaches. Companies should prioritize building diverse teams to enhance productivity and creativity. Furthermore, they should develop methods to measure the impact of diversity initiatives, recognizing that improvements may not be immediately quantifiable, but will still yield significant long-term results. Third, AI and cybersecurity, and I love that we went here. The advancement of AI presents both opportunities and challenges in cybersecurity. While AI tools can augment cyber attacks, they can also become essential for defenders to scale their impact and address the cybersecurity talent gap. Fourth, it's important to implement systemic changes to foster inclusion. To support women aspiring to leadership roles and to create inclusive environments, companies must adopt systemic changes. This includes removing bias from recruitment, evaluation, and promotion processes, and establishing programs that foster a sense of belonging. The selection of AI tools should prioritize those with reduced bias, and organizations should move beyond mere rhetoric to implement concrete, measurable actions that promote diversity and inclusion at all levels. We covered a lot more during the discussion, so please give it another listen if you missed anything. We'll see you next time, and remember, DICE is your best resource to find the tech talent you need to fill your open roles, and for tech pros, the best place to grow your tech career.